Now, does that mean that it's prepared to go to war with, say, Iran? Absolutely not. I see no evidence for that. I don't think they want to go to war at all. I think they'd like to be able to do what they've done in Syria. And that's another issue. You have the Muslim Brotherhood, which is dominating more and more in much of the Arab world. And that reports to Mr. Erdogan. He's the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood. And that's particularly threatened to the Egyptians and threatening to the Jordanians. So they have felt Assad's fall very acutely. Assad was, despite whatever he's accused of, and he's constantly demonized, because that's what we do when we decide we don't like someone, he actually maintained minority rights, protected Christians, Druze, Shiites, Armenians, others, and he's now gone. And horrific things are happening behind the scenes, although Putin has intervened with his Chechen allies to try and moderate that and persuade the Jelani and his friends to behave differently. But then, as you see, the Israelis were anxious to benefit from the spoils of Syria, and they've moved into Syria, despite Mr. Erdogan's insistence that they get out, that Syria must remain, retain some integrity, even though historically Syria is a region, not really a nation. So that's a problem. And the Israelis are now beginning to come to terms with reality that the border to the north beyond the Golan Heights is not a border with this place called Syria. It's a border with the Turks. And that's very frightening because the Turks are the only ones in the region with the military power that would enable them to actually march into Israel. Remember, the Iranians don't have much of an army. They have this Revolutionary Guard Corps, but that's designed for what we would call low-intensity conflict and assisting Shiites wherever they are against their oppressors, who are usually Sunnis. But Iran's entirely reliant on this massive arsenal of missiles, which is extremely dangerous. But they're not about to move into Israel, whereas the Turks, yes, they could do that at some point. Well, I think we have to view each of them separately to understand their interests. The Turks are emerging from a 100-plus year sojourn out of the international system. They literally, under Ataturk, after World War I, decided to fix their borders, defend them, turn inward, and develop the country. I think that's over. I think you now have not just a leader at the top of the Turkish government, but also generations of Turks who want Turkey to act and behave like a great power. And they see themselves, especially those that are religious, as the leaders of the Sunni Islamic world, which of course they were for centuries. So this plays into things. Turkey is developing economically. Turkey has facilitated good relations with the Russians, even despite the recent developments in Syria. And as you see, the Russians and the Turks have actually come to terms pretty quickly over what's happened in Syria. And if you talk to Turkish officers in Iraq over the last 20 years, they would frequently point to towns in certain areas, and they would say Kirkuk is a Turkish city. And the American military commander would say, well, that's an Iraqi town. The Turk would shake his head. He said, you don't understand. That is a Turkish city. And the expansion into Syria was something that I think the Turks were always interested in, just as they are interested in northern Iraq, because northern Iraq and Syria were part of the Ottoman Empire. So I think you're dealing with that, but the Turks have been very restrained. They could have attacked militarily and bested any number of people. Instead, they have moved very, very cautiously. And recently, Erdogan was talking to an audience of young Turkish men and women, and they began chanting, take us to Jerusalem, take us to Jerusalem, which gives you an idea of how the Turks feel about the Israelis right now. And Mr. Erdogan said, please calm down. And then he said, patience will deliver victory. So I think you're dealing with a power that is not in a hurry, sees itself as inevitably rising in the region as a dominant power. And then I think you have to look at the Saudis and the Emirates, and I think they've changed their views. I think they feel betrayed by us. No one is happy with the most recent announcements by President Trump, where he intends to take over Gaza, where there's no international right on his part to do so. and somehow or another magically remove the population that lives there, that doesn't want to leave, and build some new Riviera on the Mediterranean. He thinks it's a great idea, and obviously the Israelis are very happy, but they're the only ones, and everyone else is adamantly opposed. This has changed I think, the tone in the region. You now have a willingness among all of the Muslims to coalesce together against Israel and potentially us, which was not there months ago. Now it really is palpable. It's indisputable. So one of the goals was on the part of the United States and Israel in their efforts to remove Assad. I did not support that because, frankly, I and others that have looked at the region thought that the alternative to Assad is what you see now: dangerous Islamist forces in power, and ultimately the Turks in power in Damascus. So that was the beginning of harm against Assad. And then, of course, MI6, the Mossad, and CIA were heavily involved in taking elements of the Islamic State and other jihadist organizations, including Al-Qaeda, repurposing them with the goal of once again attacking and destroying Assad. The Russians came to his rescue, and I think that's the one reason that he's still there. He also had the support of Hezbollah, and that's one of the reasons that so much damage was inflicted on Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, was to rob Assad of that backup that he had at his disposal, the 100,000 or so Hezbollah fighters who are very competent. And then to break this link between Iran and Lebanon through Syria, which was always sort of characterized as the axis of resistance by the Muslims and the axis of evil by the Israelis and us. Well, you recall we moved into Syria, I think, in 2010, 2011. And this was, the argument was to counter ISIS. And we took over the oil production, the only oil production that Syria had. And that immediately deprived the Syrians of income that the government desperately needed. That was a serious hit. That's also the one area in Syria where you have some real agriculture. That also was damaged. And then we encouraged the Kurds to seek autonomy in that part of Syria. These things all severely damaged Assad. We finally brought this to fruition because Assad couldn't pay his own forces. He didn't have the wherewithal to pay them. We could offer them much more money to essentially defect. And so I think what you saw was not this massive military campaign to take over. You simply saw Assad's forces either melt away or collapse because they'd all been paid off, or they simply weren't being paid enough money to justify defending anything. And we now see what's going on in Syria. And that's going to be an interesting struggle to watch because the Turks absolutely want the Kurds out. The PKK is there. They want them out. So that fight is coming. So that's the answer to some extent. It's a long one. I apologize, but that's the answer on Assad. And at the same time, now the Israelis want to expand this greater Israel, but their army is in pretty bad shape right now. It's strung out all over the country. I don't see how they can go in there and hold very much against a determined attack, unless, of course, we are going to provide the supporting military power. And I think that's the plan because we still have aircraft carrier battle groups, large Air Force elements on station, and, of course, special operations forces. I think what's happening in the Middle East is extremely dangerous because you're dealing with groups of people who have been sort of brought to a boil over the last year since October 7th. And Israel was never popular, but people had come to accept its existence. I think that's over. When you talk to people from the region, these are the elites that govern, whether you're talking about somebody in Libya or Egypt or Algeria or Pakistan and Turkey and elsewhere. What you get from people is the same. Sykes-Picot is over. In other words, we're not going to live with this menace. That's my greatest fear. You know, we have a tendency to dismiss a lot of these people as backward because for so many years, that's the way they were. Well, they're not all backward anymore. They're actually very intelligent and they produce brilliant systems, whether it involves computers or missiles or weapons. It's a mistake to take that position. It's also a mistake to think that you can bully people over and over and over again. Eventually, it fails. And if we challenge the whole region, it's not going to work well for us or Israel. What I would try to do is call a halt and de-escalate the tensions, but I don't see that happening. I see the president doubling down without perhaps understanding the enormity of the challenge and what could happen. In addition to that, he released all of these 2,000-pound bombs that we had previously said we weren't going to provide to the Israelis under Biden. All of that's very ominous because, frankly, with those kinds of munitions, you could erase Gaza within the space of a few days. But I think if that were to happen, that's where I think the rest of the region is likely to erupt. You have Jordan that has already said, if you try to force all these refugees on us, we will declare war. The Egyptians have said absolutely not, and they have moved their army into the Sinai. Are we going to assist the Israelis against the Egyptian army and Egypt itself? I don't know. And King Abdullah is in a terrible position. He's very weak. His state is not capable of withstanding too much stress. They have 11.2 million Palestinians living in Jordan, far more than we normally admit to. Very dangerous. We just shipped large numbers or whatever remaining heavy bombs to Israel. These are these things they call the mother of all bombs. You've seen pictures of it. It delivers the equivalent of a 10-kiloton warhead. Now, I don't know how the Israelis plan to deliver it. We have great difficulty delivering. It's just so huge, so heavy. And if you're going to try and fly through integrated air defenses, which is the case with Iran, you risk being shot down with that thing. I don't know. Perhaps they plan on using it against Gaza because the president has now also said that the West Bank is also going to be annexed by Israel. So presumably that is also going to be subject to a campaign of mass murder, expulsion, and ethnic cleansing, as Gaza has been. And then you have Syria, which is still in turmoil, but could become a highway for the Turkish army. And that's, of course, a nightmare on steroids if you're an Israeli right now. And then there's Iran. Will the Israelis still insist on war with Iran? Now, we've said we won't participate or join in it. But I wouldn't put it past Mr. Netanyahu to find a way to provoke a conflict with Iran, even if it requires a false flag to get us into the fight. We saw these false flags. They were organized by MI6 in Syria when the Syrians were accused of using chemical weapons against their own people. It was all nonsense. It never happened. We launched cruise missiles, you'll remember, twice, all false flag. So we're capable of doing stupid things without seriously examining what's actually going on down there. And I wouldn't put it past the president. The president is emotional, and he can be very impulsive.
But they're also aware that Egypt and Jordan are now both on the precipice of boiling over into war with Israel. I would think if the Israelis sent anyone in there, they would probably be the equivalent of our special ops. And I know the Israelis are the paranoia flag, and Israel is at full mast because Egypt's effectively mobilized for war. And this is the problem that our president now confronts. He's dealing with Netanyahu, who has enormous power and influence inside the United States, as we know. And he has tried to fulfill his promises to Miriam Adelson and others that contributed a lot of money to him. But he's put himself now at great risk. And I'm talking about President Trump and us. Because Netanyahu, ultimately, at the end of the day, is going to do what Netanyahu wants. And right now, whatever we think, he thinks that he has an opportunity to reshape the Middle East to Israel's preference. And that means the war with Iran is by no means off the table. In fact, many of those bombs that we saw delivered quite recently are no doubt destined for Iran, and the Iranians know it. They also are quite confident that they have us to support them in whatever they do, certainly with air and naval power. Well, Egypt faces a problem on three fronts that most Americans aren't aware of. They have a problem on their western flank with Libya. Libya, as you know, we removed Gaddafi, and it went through a terrible civil war. At the moment, it's roughly divided in the middle. And General Haftar, who was a former CIA asset that used to live in Annandale, Virginia, is leading the forces in the east of Libya. And it is really Mr. Erdogan, the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Turks in the West. The Egyptians are very afraid of this Muslim Brotherhood and its links to ISIS, which is why they regard Erdogan as someone who is not to be trusted. And then to the south, they have a problem in Ethiopia and Sudan. It's a water problem. And the Israelis have been down in Ethiopia working with the government, cultivating support to dam up more of the Nile River, with the full recognition that if they dam up any more of it, not much water is going to reach Egypt. And that's going to put Egyptian agriculture and industry and the economy at very severe risk. So now they're looking at the Palestinian issue. They live next door. They understand what happens if those Palestinians are either killed or driven out of Gaza. And they're not prepared to accept that. So they're sitting right now in that Philadelphia corridor, right along the border. They've made a lot of bellicose sounds. I think an Egyptian general said that he could be in Jerusalem, or not Jerusalem, I think Tel Aviv or something, in 12 hours. I think that's not impossible, but I wouldn't say so publicly. But it's had an effect. And the Egyptians are now lobbying us, I think, to do whatever we can to hold back the Egyptians. Now, there's an Arab League summit in Cairo on the 4th of March. That summit is going to address the alternative plan to what's happened in Gaza. In other words, President Trump's plan is out. It's an impossibility. So they're going to look at something else. What that will be, I don't know. That's being decided, I think, in advance this Friday in Riyadh by a smaller group of Arab states. President Trump has previously expressed his support for annexation of the West Bank. That means the West Bank could be turned into the imitation Gaza. And then there's Iran. And one wonders what the Iranians will do now that it becomes increasingly clear they're going to be pulverized by sanctions and tried to be driven into another agreement they don't really want. It's a bad situation. We don't know what could trigger it, but all of this could blow up on our faces. But the point is that all of the Arab states are now together on this, and all fear the same thing that I'm concerned about, which is that regardless of what President Trump wants, when President Netanyahu decides it's time to do so, he will resume the bombing campaign in Gaza. All of his key figures are saying it's time to complete the job, finish the job. Everybody knows what that means. And we know that President Trump is surrounded by people that are very much acolytes of Mr. Netanyahu and the Likud party. And it's not surprising that he takes that position. But as this begins to worsen, and I think it will, I really think the region is going to blow up. I've said March. It could be earlier, but I think March. If that happens, Iran will come into it. And inevitably, the Turks, who have been sitting on the sidelines, happy to cooperate with us and the Israelis in order to regain control of Syria. Note that all of the principal members of the government in Syria now, we're talking about this Jolani-led organization, they are Turkish citizens. And again, now, if you're a Saudi, if you're an Emirati, you have mixed feelings about this. Remember, the Turks ruled the whole region for many, many hundreds of years. And the experience the Arabs had with the Turks is quite mixed. So this is not something that you can deliver easily. Now, what does that mean? How did they do it? I don't know. But it's frightening. And I wouldn't underestimate the Israelis, their ingenuity or ability to deliver those weapons in some fashion that we haven't even thought of. I'm simply pointing out the realities. And at some point, the Turks will not be able to stay out of this regional fight. So, President Trump has got a very difficult path ahead. And that's why it's very important for us, to the extent that we can, and I think he understands that, to regain a better relationship and put us on a better track with Russia. The problem is that Russia will not abandon Iran if Iran comes under attack from Israel. And you're right, the bombs that you mentioned are very heavy. And normally we've delivered those with heavy bombers. In fact, the original Moabs were literally rolled out of the back of a C-130 off the ramp and dropped on Saddam Hussein's fortifications on the Saudi border.
And then if you look at it militarily, the idea of waging war against China is quite conceivably the dumbest idea in the history of mankind. There's an old expression: a ship is a fool to fight a port or fight a fort. China is the largest fort in the world. What are you going to do to it? Lob missiles and rocks at it? It's absurd. It doesn't make any sense. And you're going to do all this from the sea because Taiwan is 6,000 miles from us. That means you have to sustain logistically everything you do. And today, everything from Japan all the way to Australia that is involved with the logistical support for our air and naval forces can be targeted by the Chinese and destroyed with precision guided missiles. So the war has changed. The world has changed. The whole idea is crazy. And I think President Trump knows that. And I think President Trump's already made it clear that that's not a place he wants to go. He wants to do business with the Chinese, but he wants it to occur on an equitable basis. In other words, if it's mutually beneficial. And most of our problems with the Chinese could be secured or could be solved by securing our borders. You don't like what they're bringing into the country, kick them out, throw them out. The Chinese throw Japanese and other foreigners out of their country all the time. We could throw thousands of Chinese out of our country for stealing not just IP, being mules carrying cash for drug cartels. I mean, come on, let's get real. You don't go to war with another nation state, with one of the world's oldest civilizations, because you don't like what they're doing today in your country. So let's fix what we got as a problem here at home. Let's not go to war. I think that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. First of all, Taiwan is not under immediate threat. That has been grossly exaggerated out of all proportion to reality. If you look a couple of years ago and you read specifically what President Xi has said, he was talking about peaceful unification on or about 2040. That was his forecast. And I still think that that's likely. It could happen sooner. We also don't understand Taiwan. Taiwan is split. You've got the old Kuomintang party under Chiang Kai-shek. Well, that party is pro-Beijing. They want unification. They want to become part of China because they know China has changed. China is not a communist country. And we get confused because we don't understand that both the Chinese on the mainland and the Chinese on Taiwan aspire to the same sort of social structure. That social structure is on display. It's called Singapore. Lee Kuan Yew's formula is what both of them would follow. And then you have another large party, and you have a president from this party right now, though this party doesn't control the parliament, that is historically pro-Japanese, is now pro-American, and wants independence. It's not going to happen. The Taiwanese parliament will never go along with it because they know that's immediate war with mainland China. They don't want it. You got to understand the banking systems are interconnected. Capital flows from Taiwan into China and back out to Taiwan. So I don't see it.
What happens next? The Koreans now realize more than ever that we are leaving Korea. Now, why do I say that? Because President Trump spoke publicly and he said he would be open to South Korea having its own nuclear arsenal. Now, setting aside whether South Korea even wants that and whether or not that's necessary, that's another discussion. The important point here is that President Trump, when I last spoke to him and he asked me, how long have we been in Korea? I said, sir, almost 80 years, almost 70 years. And he said, my God, that's ridiculous. He strongly feels that these overseas garrisons that are attached to this thing that we call informally the empire should be dismantled. I think you're going to see something similar eventually happen on the peninsula with North Korea because it's a burden, not an asset. The only way North Korea has survived is because of Russia. And that's because both the Soviets and their successors saw that North Korea was a useful strategic hedge against us and Japan. Well, there are 23,000 troops and there are another 3,000, I think, Air Force. But that's not the only picture here. The larger picture is that if you remove us from the peninsula, I don't think there will be a war, and I don't think the South Koreans need a nuclear weapon. If you're going to do that, you need to do a couple of things. First of all, you have to talk to President Xi. Now, why do I say that? It's not because he loves North Korea. President Xi would like nothing better than to get rid of North Korea. Why? He's in the same position that the Russians were in or the Soviets were in back in the early 90s. I've got East Germany and West Germany. Which Germany do I really want? And the Soviets said, well, obviously, we really want West Germany. It's productive. We want to trade with it. We want to do business with it. This East Germany is a problem. And so East Germany was dropped. It literally went out of existence overnight. Now, if you pull the forces out of South Korea, there is no requirement for U.S. forces in Japan, because the U.S. forces there, primarily the Marines at Okinawa, not only, but primarily, are really there to reinforce the army on the peninsula. And the reason they're there is because Colin Powell couldn't find anything for the Marine Corps to do. And he finally said, well, look, let's give them the mission of reinforcing the army on the peninsula. And like many, many others, I don't think, Colin Powell ever thought there would be a war again on the peninsula. So we put the Marines there. We gave them literally the mission of reinforcing that. There's no requirement for them. And I would say not much requirement in Japan for us at all once we pull out of that Korean peninsula. And then the whole regional dynamic changes and it goes back to where it was in the past, with Japan once again as a major power who is the normal counterbalance, if you will, to Chinese power and influence. The Chinese never controlled anything beyond the limits of their coast. Everything else at sea was controlled by the Japanese. So what I'm trying to say is that North Korea is not going to last very long once we leave South Korea. And we don't need to worry about a war, because President Xi was the one that Kim went to see before he went to Hanoi. Why? Remember, there was this huge train, armored train, that he took from North Korea to Beijing.
Yes.
All this attention. Why was he there? He was there to see the emperor, the Chinese emperor, who is effectively Xi. And the Chinese emperor said, go to Hanoi, sign the agreement. And he bowed and said, yes, Your Imperial Majesty, I will do that. And he was prepared to sign. We're not really needed in that part of the world. And again, I think what President Trump wants to do, he wants to demilitarize our relations with Asia. He wants to do business with Asia. He just wants it to be done on a level that makes sense for us. In other words, something that's, equitable and mutually beneficial, not lopsided in any particular direction. And the way to do that is to get out of South Korea and then ultimately get out of Japan. And the Japanese, privately, behind the scenes, are chomping at the bit to regain their sovereignty 100%. Remember that before he went to Hanoi to meet with President Trump to sign this document that would have denuclearized the Korean Peninsula, it would be denuclearized by now, I suspect, if President Trump had signed that. But unfortunately, he had breathing into his ears, the voices from hell. On one side was John Bolton. On the other side was this man, Mike Pompeo.